Probably uppermost in the minds of everyone here today is the question, why does the world need another Schubert biography? So I'm going to try and answer as best I can in 15 minutes why I wrote this book and what I hope to achieve. Firstly, I want to draw your attention to the title, Schubert, a Musical Wayfarer, which plays on the great literary theme of the wanderer. Classically, the understanding of life, the unfolding of identity and creativity, the experience of growth and discovery are all articulated through the metaphor of a journey. Dante's Divine Comedy is an epic journey through hell and purgatory until the arrival in paradise. Homer's Odyssey is a great mystical journey home. Like Homer's Odyssey and Schubert's Winterreise, I've divided this book into 24 chapters to mark the division of time and Schubert's journey from childhood to realised adult life. The title, A Musical Wayfarer, responds to biographical and musical aspects of Schubert's life. It acknowledges the improvisatory nature of his life, how in some respects he was as free as the wind and got into corners of experience that escape the settled fixed person, how his life was a constant flow of emergence. It places music at the very centre of that life, alludes to Schubert's heavenly lengths, his music's ability to constantly surprise us, and also his desire to traverse so many musical genres. Alice Warwick's cover design and original drawing of a very contemplative Schubert captures beautifully how nomadic Schubert's inner life was. All our lives are, or as Hegel has called it, the unrest that is the self. And it suggests how within Schubert and around Schubert there was an invisible world, and how his relationship to the invisible influenced so much of his life. So why I wrote this book? Well, the commission came in response to a keynote lecture I gave in London on a question which, as Andrea mentioned, has preoccupied me for many years. How the prospect of death can be the greatest single inspiration of human creativity and passion. In relation to Schubert, my basic premise is when the brevity of Schubert's presence on earth was suddenly brought into sharp relief, it intensified his sense of urgency. The greater his integrity and awareness, the more original and creative his time became. If I'm to single out two reasons why I accepted the commission to write a biography on Schubert, the first is I loved the challenge of it. I loved the challenge of writing a biography on a composer on whom so many biographies had been written. How do you write a biography on a composer who's written 936 works? How do you write the same book for a scholarly and a public audience? And then there were the challenges associated with the literary style. How do you mediate very dense research with the lighter touch needed for biographical narrative? How do you breathe life into historical figures without stepping over from fact into fiction? And how can you write objectively and avoid the problem of transference, an idea in biographical theory that what we write says less about the subject and more about ourselves? If I talk about myself, it's to tell you how I approach some of these challenges as Schubert's biographer and how I endeavoured to live up to the responsibility it entails and be worthy of my readers' trust. Writing a biography forces you to contemplate life in general, but also your own. In writing this biography about a composer facing his mortality at the age of 25, while living alongside another composer who lived a long and rich life and was facing his own mortality in a very different way, means that I was keenly and am keenly aware of the brevity of life, even if we live into old age. So if I'm to pick one reason why I can justify spending so many years of my life writing about Schubert, which is the reason why we're talking about him 200 years later. It's because of how deeply and unequivocally his music speaks to me. I cannot imagine writing a biography on Schubert without this focus. It wouldn't make any sense to me. So what I hope to achieve, the world doesn't need another biography of Schubert with the same facts, the same anecdotes told all over again. As many different pathways had been taken, one of the great tasks of writing this biography was to communicate a style of writing biography which is original and yet right for the individual contribution I can make. So 3 examples of my goals and how I strove to achieve them. Firstly, I knew that to recount a great journey takes time. It can't be rushed. When you survey what Schubert achieved at such a tempo, everything becomes thin. So I consciously avoided discussing every single work and endeavoured to show instead how the broad trajectory of Schubert's life was a constant pilgrimage of discovery, and how that discovery enlarged and refined his sensibility. Secondly, I wanted to create a more nuanced portrait of the man, because biography and identity are not the same thing. A good biography should unfold identity, which is much more complex, make it visible, and put the mirror of it out there. And one of the ways of doing that is to address another thorny subject in biographical theory of how and whether pathways between Schubert's life and art can be mapped. I also endeavoured to relate the world of hearing to the world of seeing. In other words, how Schubert's music is linked to perception. I knew from the beginning that my biography would be judged on what is original, and I'm going to take just the opening section as an example of how we are still learning to become Schubert's contemporaries. One of the things which is overshadowed in traditional portraits of Schubert is how multicultural his roots were. In the opening chapter of the book, I've tried to capture something of the shy beauty of Schubert's ancestors, who tilled the Czech lands, who quietly made their life sacred. Their presence has the feel of unaffected authenticity. Theirs was a spirituality that drew no attention to itself. Many of Schubert's ancestors lived through great difficulty, but their quiet and subtle lives never saw any need for brash declarations of spirit. Rather, they exhibited a shyness that is natural to Schubert and to the human soul itself. So at the beginning of the book, I show how Schubert is an expression and an extension of a long family lifeline signalled through the use of patronymics, and I also show a long chain of belonging in the name Franz. In the opening chapter, I endeavoured to show how the beautiful value of pietas as prospective as well as retrospective duty, how Schubert's family on both sides is an incredible intertwining of multiple streams of ancestry, memory, shadow and light. In the first section, Bearings, I show how Schubert's family provided the cradle where identity unfolds and firms, and how such belonging outgrows itself. I wanted to humanise the very one-dimensional portrait of Schubert's father, and I deliberately framed the book with him. I tried to show how gifted and determined he was, how he shaped Schubert and the music he wrote. And characteristically, music history has obliterated Schubert's mother's Silesian lineage, but in his music, Schubert made sure his mother had her place. Her death in May 1812 marks the beginning of Schubert's compositional life and his ability to transform loss into presence. This brings me to my second example. Schubert's training is always rooted in the Austro-Germanic tradition. His early exercises traced back to Albrechtsberger. but there are very few hard and fast positions that cannot be altered by research. I have recentered Schubert's formative musical training within the Italian Partimento teaching tradition and rehabilitated Salieri's influence as an extraordinary teacher. It explains, for example, how Schubert's lifelong practices of self-borrowing and resetting. It explains why Schubert was setting Italian texts by metastasio, which is a central part of this teaching tradition. Improvisation, which is at the very core of this training, offers a new way of understanding Schubert's handling of harmony and form, and raises compelling questions about the shifting relationship between freedom and structure. All through the book, I continually found evidence of this as I was writing, in his unconscious use of schemata in the introduction to the B minor symphony, for example. So as you can see from this first section, I continually address themes and works where I have something new to say. To give just 3 more examples across the book. The first is religion. It's usually believed that Schubert turned away from the church, and the perception of Schubert as a church music composer is new. Initially, when I was asked to write this book, I thought I'm not an historian in terms of political history, but my knowledge of the Goethe-Zeit, which spans Schubert's entire lifetime, enabled me to situate Schubert's music in a broad cultural context, literary and philosophical movements of the age. So, for example, I was able to offer a new perspective of Schubert's omission of mass texts in relation to the religious crisis of his age. I've also shown how Schubert was far better known as a church music composer than is ever given credit. And I've explored the theme of sacred and secular scriptures, discussing the Great C Major Symphony as a deeply religious work and comparing Winterreise to the Book of Job. My second example is Schubert's years of crises, first discussed in the Festschrift for Arnold Weil, around which I've centred the third section of the book, and I've divided the crises into 2 distinct phases. The first was an existential crisis at the age of 21, when he stopped lessons with Salieri, was at loggerheads with his father, and burnt out after composing 600 of his 936 works. His second crisis was much more than sexuality, and is much closer to what mystics would call the dark night of the soul. But it is also a phase of exile, in which suffering as the cause of consciousness speaks powerfully, and suffering as the cause of musical consciousness. And the third example is a theme I had to discuss because I knew I would be expected to, and that's Schubert's sexuality. At first, I had decided to present vignettes of close friendships and allow the reader to make up their own mind without pretending to know what we cannot know. So, for example, I recontextualized his relationship with Theresa Grob alongside his diary entry on marriage. I showed what we can know of friendships with Meyerhofer, Vogel and Schober, and contextualized their letters in relation to censorship in Metternich's Vienna and 19th century literature on same-sex relations. Although I came to my own conclusions of Schubert's sexuality, I resisted the temptation to write a biography for an LGBTQ generation in favour of highlighting sexist assumptions in musicology, and took a very hard line on respect for the privacy of the individual. Our culture no longer recognises a sacred zone around Schubert. We've lost a certain reverence of approach. For me, for example, 5 people bearing witness to Schubert's love for Carolina von Esterházy says far less about Schubert's heterosexuality and far more about the ache of longing in the human heart. Her presence is a reminder, perhaps, of one of the secrets of death, how Schubert brought into the eternal world not only his known life, but also the unknown, unchosen lives as well. To round off, as I wrote, I tried to highlight the extraordinary fecundity of Schubert's practical contribution to the musical life of his times and ours, because despite the tragedy of his short life, despite how deeply he suffered, there is a definite, unapologetic drive which runs through Schubert's art, a rallying cry that celebrates music for being on the side of life, continuity of effort, and enlargement of the spirit. When writing this book, I was often remembered a line by Seamus Heaney, "Human beings are put on earth to create civilization." If we accept that definition of a raison d'être, then we will admit that Schubert was true to that purpose and indeed proved central to it. In summary, to contemplate a composer's life is to be called to attention in a completely personal way. We only have to glance at Schubert's collected works to be reminded of how vigorously and how extensively and in what singular solitude he entered upon a way to art and followed it to the end. This seriousness, this psychic weight and emotional purchase of his music, this ability to reach the place of suffering and decision in each of us is what attracted me to Schubert and kept growing on me in the years when I was writing this book. New life can only stream from old sources if the lines to those sources are kept open, and in this regard my biography will, I hope, have a vital humanist and scholarly role to play. One of the paradoxes at the heart of this biography is how someone who died so young managed to create immortal images of the human condition which engage us in profound meditations on art, illness, life and death. More than ever, I feel meaning and value of our ongoing dialogues with Schubert's musical life and afterlives, which today we are celebrating.